And on that note, it is then time to introduce our excellent speaker, Dan Draper, who will be talking to us about debugging diversity. Dan, we haven't done a rehearsal of the slide changeover. I'm just going to stop sharing, and that should allow you to go for it.
Cool, we'll give this a try. All right, share screen. Cool, hopefully you can all see my screen. I'll take that. Is someone nodding? I can't tell. Cool, okay, yes. So saw a thumbs up, awesome. And you can all hear me okay, presumably?
Yes.
See head shaking, but I'm going to take that as trolling. Cool. All right. So look, my name is Dan Draper, as mentioned, and I'm actually the VP of Engineering for a company called Medical Director here in Sydney. We don't actually use Ruby at Medical Director, but I don't code much during the day anymore, so it doesn't really matter too much to me. But I've been sort of a part of the Ruby community for many years. I first started using Ruby back in 2005, I think it was. It was Rails 0.8. So many years, showing my age a bit, and still have a very fond love of it. So it's good to be speaking here. So what I wanted to talk to you all about tonight is another topic that I'm very passionate about, and that's diversity, in particular in the tech industry. And I've got a couple of things that I'll sort of go into about me first. So I started on this journey about 6 years ago. The journey that led me, I guess, to presenting on this topic tonight. And some of you are probably wondering, how is it that a white, straight man ends up talking about diversity? It wasn't something I'd actually intended on doing. It was something I have to admit I kind of accidentally fell into. But as I learned more about it, I realized just how important it is for there to be voices from every sort of part of our tech community, and in particular, because tech is already so male dominated, it's important that men understand some of the challenges around diversity and inclusion in our industry, and can also become better champions of change. So it started for me back about six and a half, actually coming up to 7 years ago now. A friend of mine and I started a YouTube channel called Quotas TV, and we created a few videos. We did some lighthearted stuff around pairing and tried to make it a bit fun. And then one day we were sort of talking about some ideas about things we wanted to work on, and I can't remember who said it, but one of us said, "Oh, maybe we should do something kind of meta, something around culture and technology." And oh, I don't know, maybe we should do a video on why there aren't many women in tech. And we're all sort of scratching our heads, why aren't there many women in tech? And you can imagine how naive that must have sounded. But we really didn't have a clue. And to be honest, I don't think the industry was as aware of it collectively back in 2014 as it is now. And so I decided I was going to go talk to a few women in tech, particularly software engineers, and try to understand a bit more about what challenges there were. And I realized that one YouTube video was definitely not going to cut it. And so I decided I was going to try and make a feature-length documentary, talk about hubris, right? But anyway, I ended up quitting my job, and I went on a 3-month trip around the US and interviewed well, actually, since then I've interviewed a number more, but at the time I think I'd interviewed about 35 or 40 different folks, mostly women, but quite a few different people who were either champions of change or female engineers themselves, or people that could help me understand not only the challenges of diversity in tech, but more importantly, we were really keen to understand how we could start to facilitate change and to drive change. And so I came out of that. If you've ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's this idea that when you first learn about a topic, you tend to, because you are so ignorant about the topic, you actually tend to assume you know much more about it than you do. And then as you start to learn a bit more about it, you realize just how ignorant you are. And it's like you know enough to know that you don't know anything. And that was definitely the experience I had. I describe it as me falling off the idiot mountain. I was blissfully ignorant, and then as I learned more, it was actually very confronting for me in lots of ways. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned throughout that process, certainly not the only thing I learned, but one of the most important, I guess, is that I have privilege. It was hard for me to recognize that, or even admit that for a little while, because I don't come from a wealthy family. I've had a number of setbacks in my career and so forth. I had a business failure in my 20s, and I didn't ever consider myself to have privilege. But the thing is, none of my setbacks had anything to do with my gender or race or sexuality. And the people that don't necessarily have privilege often have a harder time even getting to where I am. And that was a tough realization for me. But I really encourage everyone to reflect on what privilege they may or may not have. I mean, most people, especially living in Australia, will have a level of privilege to some extent, but of course some have more than others. So it's an important thing to reflect on. The other thing that I learned was some of the, I guess, eye-watering statistics in technology. I mean, probably if you, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably seen some of these numbers before. Something like 24% of software engineers are women. The numbers are pretty similar in most, say, Western countries. The US, Australia, and UK are the countries that I've sort of most focused on. But more alarming than that is that only 6% of technology leaders are women. And that's something that I've certainly through anecdotal evidence and experience working in technology teams, certainly something I've noticed. And in fact, it's often even less than that. Sometimes the team I have at Medical Director, as hard as we are working to change that, unfortunately, is mostly male at the leadership level. And worse than that, less than 3% of women of color. These are American statistics. If you reflect on Australian indigenous software engineers, there are really no statistics kept on those numbers, and presumably the numbers are extremely low. But certainly there is actually really no data on it, so it's hard to say for sure. Something there is a lot of data on is from the National Center for Women in Technology in the US. It's run by a woman named Lucy Sanders, who I was lucky enough to interview for the film when I was in Boulder, in Colorado. She's at University of Colorado at Boulder. And they keep statistics of female participation in computer science, and that covers all the sort of the related disciplines. So software engineers, testers, QAs, those kinds of things. And what's really alarming is you might be forgiven for thinking that over the last 10 years, you quite often see talks about particularly gender participation in technology. There's organizations like Women Who Code or Girls in Tech. So you would be forgiven for thinking that things are improving, but sadly they're not. These numbers are from roughly 2003 all the way up to 2017, and that number hasn't really changed. In fact, it's a little bit lower than it was 15 years ago, which is pretty alarming. But the most alarming number of all is this one. 51% of women will leave engineering. And I've shared this number with groups at talks a few times before. And I've had people say, oh, is that because, women are going to make babies, or they're going on parental leave or whatever? And I say, no, actually, that is also a challenge, the share of parenting duties and home duties and so forth. But let's not get into that for this discussion. That is actually excluded from this number. This is just the number of women that are leaving because they're frustrated. And some of the reasons that was quoted in the studies, they're treated unfairly, underpaid, less likely to be fast-tracked than their male colleagues, and unable to advance. And this is something that, every time I've shared this talk, I've almost always had a couple of women come up to me and say, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly how I felt. And they'll, sometimes will tell me an anecdote of, some personal experience where they've felt some of these things. And of course, I haven't got a slide for this, but the other important factor is pay gap. pay gap is still very real. And yes, some of it is because women bear the unfair share, I might say, of parenting duties. That is a key part of the gender pay gap. But there's also a very important and very real component that is simply related to inequity. So it's really important to acknowledge this. So one of the things that I'm involved in the Men Championing Change group in Sydney. Actually, I believe there is one now in Melbourne as well. And one of the things that we often talk about, there's a bunch of technology leaders that come along to these events, and we talk about how we can, affect pay reviews, gender pay reviews across the organization, setting proper levels in the organization, making sure that women are reviewed fairly in the same way that men are. There's all these kinds of challenges that we like to think about and tackle. So that's sort of the bad news. Let's sidetrack for a second and talk a little bit about, well, what do we mean by diversity? Now, I always get slightly nervous when I talk about this in any kind of group setting, because I'm really not the diversity, and there are plenty of people that know a lot more about this stuff than I do, especially people that perhaps themselves may be marginalized. So forgive me if I'm telling anyone stuff they already know, but hopefully there's enough folks on the call that learn a bit from this talk. So the first thing we might want to think about is economic diversity. So what are our preferences? And I'm not talking about sexual preferences. I'm talking about, what we like to buy, where we like to eat, where we like to travel, those kinds of things. And that's how an economist might think of diversity. And then, of course, there's the typical way that we usually describe diversity, which is, our identity, gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and so forth. And that's usually how we think about it. What do we mean by sex, gender, and sexuality? It's a common misconception. People get confused between, it's less so sexuality, but certainly get very confused with sex and gender. So I thought it might be worth just quickly touching on those things. So sex really effectively means your physical attributes. So what genitalia do you have effectively? And somebody may have, maybe intersex may have, different, they may have testes and ovaries, for example, or they may be transitioning. A gender, a person's self-expression. So basically how they see themselves, how they personally identify, even though, say, for example, that a person may see themselves as a woman, but they may have a penis. It's their gender expression that we're talking about. And of course, sexuality, who is a person attracted to, or in some cases not. Often in sexuality, we talk about whether you like boys or girls or whatever, or both, or people to whom you are attracted sort of intellectually. We often don't talk about people who just don't feel sexual attraction, so asexual folks. So it's important to remember those as well. And you've probably all seen this acronym. I won't ask anyone to tell me what this means. It can be helpful to know what the different terms mean, but it's also just wanted to point out that using this term, and sometimes we say the LGBTQ community. I think it's more perhaps more appropriate to simply use the term to say LGBTQ person. Community sometimes can even make marginalized people feel perhaps even more marginalized. Just bear that in mind. And then the last area of diversity, which I think is really important and can also be very tightly related to identity diversity, is how people think. Your cognition, your cognitive approach, or cognitive diversity, if you like. And that's often related to your education, your beliefs. Obviously, beliefs can be very tightly related to your religion. What biases you might have, and everybody has biases of some kind. We all have different ones. Many of us have similar ones, but we all have our own unique way of thinking and approaching the world. And in particular, and where this is very relevant to our industry and the technology industry, is how we approach problem solving and how different ways of thinking can help us solve problems differently, or in some cases more effectively. So you put all those three things together: your preferences, your identity, and how you think. It's what makes up you. And you are a unique individual and a unique person on this world. But one of the things we often miss when we're thinking about diversity is we like to, it's very easy, I shouldn't say we like to, that's not fair, but it's very easy to fall in the trap of putting people into a box, a bucket. But in reality, usually there's, people will subscribe to this idea of intersectionality. So what does intersectionality mean? It's essentially this idea that, say for example, you're a black woman working for a company. Now, you may not necessarily be unfairly treated because you're a woman, because the company doesn't unfairly treat white women. Or you might not necessarily be unfairly treated because you're black, because the company doesn't necessarily unfairly treat black men. It's the combination of factors that can sometimes lead to, being persecuted effectively, not necessarily getting the same opportunities, or being having disproportional opportunities. There's a lot to be said for intersectionality. It's probably a whole talk, but it's really important to, I guess, recognize that it's not necessarily just somebody's race or their sexuality or their gender that is, that is the area of consideration. It's where somebody sort of lives on this idea of intersectionality, if that makes sense. So why does diversity in tech matter? Well, there's a few reasons. Let's start with some of the basics. You might argue it's the right thing to do. In Australia, we have equal opportunity laws, and lots of companies claim to be equal opportunity employers. I think very few really live and breathe that, but we can aspire to be that. I think many of us, even if we don't necessarily understand the nuances or challenges of it, would agree that equal opportunity is an important thing. I think it's also really important to close the gender pay gap. And one alarming statistic, which I think highlights this idea of being the right thing to do, is that women in Australia retire with 40% less super than men. And that's pretty alarming. It's also worth pointing out that it's good for society. The elevation of women across cultures tends to correlate with better outcomes more broadly. I won't get into New Zealand's Prime Minister at the moment, but that's perhaps one example. Another example, another reason is, does your team represent the people that use your products? My wife uses an application called Eve. It's an app on her phone. It's also all around women's sexual health. Now, as a man, I wouldn't even pretend to know where to start with building an application like that. I think it's no doubt there are male developers on the team that make Eve, but I think it's really important that the people that are building that application, and it's certainly the case with Eve, there are members of the team that are representative of the community you're serving. Obviously, there needs to be women on that team in order to understand the use cases and understand the nuances of building a product like that. Another really interesting example that I heard, I went to a conference, this is a few years ago now, in Melbourne, called Alley Bites. It's all around accessibility. I'm not sure if anyone has come across that before. If they start running them again, when we hopefully go back to normal, I highly encourage you to check it out. And there was a woman speaking at one of the sessions. Now, she was mostly blind and had very severe hearing impairment. And I really admired her. Must have taken enormous courage to get up on a stage in front of hundreds of people, not being able to see them and not really being able to hear them, and speaking about something that was really quite confronting. And she shared a story of, I think it was a council in Greater Melbourne that, those, I call them the robot toilets. So you see them, the public toilets that have like robotic doors and they got lights on them, and you have to press a button to get in and out, all that sort of stuff. And she said that she found a Braille sign on the front door of this robot toilet. And it said, please do not enter if light is red. And this was in Braille. So you can imagine disgust or just disappointment, I guess. You obviously somebody who was not vision impaired had anything to do with the creation of that sign, because they wouldn't have made a mistake like that. So it's really, really important to think about. And then there's a final reason which I'll share, and I'll go into in a little bit more detail, which is it's good for business to have a diverse team. And this is from a McKinsey study in 2015. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have returns above the industry mean. And this is something that has been shown again and again by study after study. Harvard Business Review had a study on it as well. And why is it? Well, there's sort of a fundamental principle behind it. Homogeneous teams, when we're all the same, they feel easier. But easy is often bad for performance. And that's due to this idea of the fluency heuristic. So fluency heuristic is basically groupthink. When we're all saying the same thing, we all have the same opinion about something. We were talking about MongoDB before. We all agree, maybe we all agree that MongoDB is a poor database. Well, then it must mean that it's a poor database if we all agree. And that's not necessarily the case. I'm not advocating for MongoDB, by the way. I'm just using it as an example. But if it's very easy to fall into the trap, if everybody's saying the same thing, then we must have the right answer. And as soon as you get, say, a different opinion, slightly different perspective on it, that can cause a little bit of uncertainty, maybe even a bit of conflict. And that, I guess it's easy to want to avoid those kinds of situations, but actually we often get much better outcomes when we do that. At Expert 360, in my previous role, when I was on the leadership team, we had quite a diverse group of leaders. It was about 50-50 men and women, and various different cultural backgrounds. And we would often get into some fairly impassioned debates about what the right way to go was. And I was getting challenged on some views quite often, which I admit when it first happened, I was a bit confronted by it, but I learned to realize, I started to realize and learned to embrace it, and learned to realize that it actually gave us much better outcomes, because I was starting to see things from a different perspective. And that's the kind of thing you can get when you have a more diverse group of people working together to solve problems. And one way to think about that is that diversity drives creativity. One of the folks I interviewed for the Debugging Diversity project was a guy called Scott Page, who is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan. And he's actually one of the leaders in research. He's got a book called The Difference, which basically is the economics of diverse teams, so explores the economics of diverse teams. And he uses an example. There's a tool used to measure creativity called the brick test. So the brick test is give somebody a brick and ask them to come up with different ways you can use the brick to do things, to smash things or to build things or whatever. And the more things that that person comes up with, essentially the more creative they are. At least that's the way they think about it. But what happens when you have a diverse team is really interesting. So let's, his particular slant on the brick test is used for plastic straws. In fact, he does this as an exercise, and he regaled me with a story of doing this for Expedia. And this is part of the film, actually. They gave a group of executives at Expedia this test. So come up with as many uses as you can for plastic straws. And person one came up with A, B, C, and D, four different uses. So now we had 4 different uses. Person 2 came up with a couple more. So now we have a couple more. Person 3 came up with 5, a good number. But what's interesting is that there weren't any new ideas that came out of that. So we were adding more people, but we weren't necessarily getting any novelty. We weren't getting any innovation. We weren't getting any new input into solving the problem. But the person who came up with the fewest actually had ideas that were not present in any of the other people's lists. So now all of a sudden, we massively increased the number of ideas for, in this case, used for plastic straws. But I think this is a really interesting example of how having a different in this case, essentially cognitive diversity, but remember cognitive diversity is related to the other kinds of diversity, can give us a much better outcome. So we had more possibilities that we could explore in order to say solve the problem. So bearing all that in mind, let's say that I've convinced you that diversity is something we should care about. What can you do? Well, number one is acknowledge. Acknowledge that this is a problem. I don't like to presume that anyone on the call would fit into this category, but I've met lots of folks, mostly men, over the last 6 years as I've I guess started to share my knowledge, my lessons that I've learned over the years with others. I've had a lot of men challenge me on some of these ideas. I even had a guy come up to me at a meetup probably about a year ago. I won't name the meetup. And he said, but aren't men just better coders? I just about fell off my chair. I mean, there's been study after study to really debunk that idea. In fact, there was a famous test that had two groups of mathematicians, a group of men and a group of women, and they were given the same test. Now, sorry, there were two groups of mixed, and they were given the same test. The first group, which was mixed, said, were told at the beginning of the test that men and women do about the same. There's no real difference between how they perform based on their gender. And so, what do you know? When they did the test, they performed roughly on par. You know, some were much better at the test, and some were not. But there was no correlation between sex or gender as to effectiveness at doing the test. However, the second group were given the same test, but they were told at the beginning that men tend to perform better. And guess what? The men actually did perform better. So one thing that we really need to be very careful about is making sure that we are giving everybody in our teams the same opportunities, the same elevation, the same equity, if you like. And that starts by acknowledging that this is a problem, and it's a problem that we need to tackle, and also becoming aware of our own privilege. So that's number one. Be glue. So what do we mean by glue? Well, there's a talk that's been doing the rounds the last couple of years by Tanya Riley called Being Glue. And what she describes as glue work is this idea that in a mixed team, technology mixed team, the women tend to be the ones, not always, but tend to be the ones that organize so-and-so's birthday cake on a Friday afternoon, or organize the drinks, or make sure the project report has been shared with the product manager, or whatever it is. It's almost always the women that do that. And the challenge is, of course, that if you're in an organization that doesn't necessarily recognize some of that work as being is factoring into, say, promotion opportunities or compensation, those kinds of things. Or worse, it means that those women are often doing the glue work instead of being engineers, which is what they're paid to do. And so when I say be glue, I think men in teams need to recognize that it's usually the women that take on these responsibilities. And so organize somebody's birthday cake when you hear about it, or make sure that people are arriving to stand up on time, or whatever it is. Sometimes these are manager responsibilities or team lead responsibilities, but so often it's the women in the team that take it on. So I could go on, but have a look at the YouTube video. She does a much better job of explaining this challenge than I will, and it's really enlightening. Number 3, call out bad behavior. This is sometimes it can be a bit hard to do. I completely understand that, especially if it's perhaps someone that's maybe more senior than you, or if you're a bit of an introvert and this person isn't, that can be very challenging, very confronting, and especially in a group situation. But if you witness, let's be honest, it's most likely going to be a man, but if you see any bad behavior, please try to call it out. In a group situation, that can be tricky, although I've done it a few times before with some success. That can alienate the person who you're calling out. The most effective way I've found to do that is, let's say that something was said in a meeting. It's so often not even something explicit. It's not, it's really, really easy to call somebody out if they've just dropped the C-bomb in a meeting, or if they've been overtly sexist or something like that. But it's often not the way that it pans out. It's usually something more subtle, like, maybe there's one person in the meeting who just talks over women, or doesn't even look at the women in the meeting, is only looking at the men, for example. I see these little subtle things quite often. And I'll share one story of where I've seen that. There was a guy in my team, and he was doing that. He's a very passionate guy, and I don't hold that against him. But he was talking over this one of the women in the team just consistently, and I glanced over at her whenever it happened, and I could see the visible frustration she was experiencing, and this guy just wasn't getting it. So I went and tapped him on the shoulder after the meeting, and I said, "Hey, you got two minutes? Let's go grab a coffee." And I shared with him what I'd observed, and he was mortified. I actually just don't think he had any idea what he was doing or what impact he was having on how that woman was feeling. So it certainly wasn't a conscious thing for him, but it was really important for me to call that out, because he became aware of it, and he actually came up to me next meeting and he said, "Hey, how was that? Was any feedback from me this time?" And it was kind of funny. It was cute in a way, but it was just so. It felt good that he was starting to realize the impact of his own behavior. So I really encourage you to give that a go if you can. Number 4, don't fall into the merit trap. So I'm sure many of you have heard this before, this idea, we only hire on merit. We only hire the best engineers. Now, the merit trap is this idea that it sort of relates to what we were talking about before, where, a diverse perspective can actually give you a better outcome. It's really important to be clear about what merit means to your organization. It doesn't necessarily mean how, one group of very like-minded individuals sees merit or sees the world or sees performance in your organization. I think you need to look at a variety of different factors as to what makes somebody perform in a role, and make sure that you're not ruling out particular people too early, say in the hiring process or in the promotion process. I'll give you a couple of examples. So you've probably all heard it. Yeah, so you've all heard that before. This is a good quote. I'll just share this. If you have a dominant group that looks or talks a particular way, they're going to describe characteristics of merit that can exclude a broader talent pool. So think about, what is your definition of merit? One of the traps you can fall into is this idea of cognitive bias. So I'll give you an example of one cognitive bias, which is very prevalent in hiring. And that is, men tend to be judged based on their potential. So what we believe they're capable of. And women tend to be more judged on what they have achieved and less so about what they're capable of. And actually, if you read some of the studies, it's both men and women who fall victim of this cognitive bias. It's not just a male, it's not just men that think this. It's unconscious bias affects everybody. But this is a common one. And one of the ways you can tackle that is through this idea of situation, task, action, and result. So it's called the STAR technique in interviewing. Has anyone ever come across this before? Yep, you can see one hand up. So I can only see like 3 faces on my screen at the moment, so apologies if anyone else had the hand up. Basically, you're asking people to describe a situation where they have had a challenge, a situation, what task they were given, or they were assigned to themselves, what action they took, and what was the result. So this is really testing somebody's ability, or testing how well somebody has achieved something in the past. And I really encourage you to ask STAR questions with every candidate, but then also ask questions that start to assess how well they might achieve something in the future. You know, ask you know, give them hypotheticals and so forth. But the key here is asking consistent questions. So recruiting for behavior or attitude first rather than skills. So it's very tempting in software engineering to go and hire for skills first. But I would argue that it's much easier to give somebody some coaching on some skills than it is to coach somebody on the behavior. It's sort of, you might think of it as the brilliant jerk problem. You know, you've got a really, really awesome engineer and they've just got a bad attitude. It's much, much harder to deal with that. And I learned that the hard way, to be honest. I had somebody working for me in a previous organization. I won't name the organization. And this guy was an excellent engineer. He was a really good coder, but he was just not very, you know, there were lots of kind of attitudinal and cultural challenges. You know, he was treating people poorly and getting into arguments with people and being really dismissive and so forth. And it took me a little while to realize that, but I ended up making the call to have him leave the organization. And that was a very good call because the team, I could just, you know, felt this sigh of relief, collective sigh of relief. And so now I actually interview, when I'm interviewing and I'm looking for candidates, I have the jerk test. I ask questions. I ask, can you tell me about a time when you were wrong? Or can you tell me about a time when you've had a conflict with another member of the team and how you may have been able to resolve that? So all these kinds of questions can help. I mean, this is not just a gender and inclusion thing, right? This is just having a good, happy team, but it can have a big impact on your gender inclusion as well, and inclusion more generally. In fact, at Expert 360, we ended up with over a third of our team were women, which is you know, much higher than the industry average. I'll move on. There's quite a lot more I could talk about there. We can maybe talk about that with some questions later on. And the last one is elevate others. So this is sometimes easier said than done, I guess. But it's really important to think about, especially if you are somebody that has privilege, somebody that's maybe a bit more senior in an organization, a senior engineer or a tech lead or manager or something like that. What opportunities might there be for others around you to step up and move to the next stage, and what might you be able to do to facilitate that? And I'll give you another example. There was a woman who was working in my team. I'm happy to share this time around, Expert 360, and she would only, I think she'd only been in the industry for a couple of years, and Expert 360 was her first real sort of software engineering job. She'd gone through General Assembly, and we were using Elixir at Expert 360, and this lady had become fairly competent at Elixir, but I don't think she'd really recognized that herself yet. And I encouraged her. I said to her one night at the Elixir Sydney meetup, I said, why don't you do a talk? She said, what? No, I can't do a talk. I said, absolutely you can. And I gave her a nudge. It wasn't too hard a push, but it was a gentle nudge in that direction. And she was terrified when she rocked up to the next event. But we had a bit of a chat about it beforehand, and she, sort of calmed her nerves, and she got up and did her talk, and she nailed it. And she came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh my God, I did it! I couldn't believe it. I didn't think I could do it, but I did it." And then she became a regular speaker at Elixir Sydney, and I think she actually told me sometime after that all she needed was a nudge. She didn't think she could do it, but she just needed someone to push her in the right direction. And so I think we each have a responsibility to do that if we can. Sort of talk about that. Try to give credit. Structured pay bands, that sort of comes into the pay gap stuff we talked about as well. Recommend somebody for promotion, especially if you're a manager. It's very hard for a lot of established organizations to do this, but if you can get to having open salaries or at the very least structured pay bands, I really encourage you to try and do that. The gold standard for that I've experienced is Buffer, the social media company. They actually publish all of their salaries and even against individual names on their website, which is pretty unusual, but super powerful. So there's really no way you can have a gender pay gap because it's all public. So I can summarize all of these things. I tried to do it in sort of this A, B, C, D, E format. It's a bit naff, but hopefully it'll help you try and remember. So acknowledge, be glue, call out bad behavior, don't fall into the merit trap, and elevate others. So yeah, that's a few tips and tricks that you might want to try yourselves. And if you'd like to learn a bit more about debugging diversity, you can check it out at the website, debuggingdiversity.com. It's actually going to be a TV series now instead of a documentary, mainly because we realized we even more so than the YouTube series, even a documentary couldn't do justice to the topic. You know, we realized that we were focusing very much on gender, which is of course a really important topic, but we weren't doing justice to sort of other elements of inclusion in technology. And so hopefully if the first few episodes are well received, we'll make more of them as we go. So yeah, check it out and feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter if you're interested. That's it. Any questions?
Firstly, just to say thank you very much for talking with us. Everyone if you can see us all in gallery mode doing our silent clapping.
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly appreciate you coming to chat to us, especially in the middle of lockdown fatigue in Melbourne. It's nice to have such an interesting talk, and I'm sure there will be questions. I'll leave the floor open and let that begin if anybody wants to jump in.
Cool, no worries.
So when's the movie out?
Well, if I was doing this full time, I'd probably say like a month, but I'm hoping that we're going to get it done by the end of the year, at least. So first 3 episodes should be done by the end of the year, I hope. see how lockdown plays into that as well. Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for talking. I thought you tackled it with a lot of respect, which was really nice to hear. I'm just wondering if you had any tips for putting up job advertisements to make them kind of more inclusive and attract like a kind of broader crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I've explored quite a bit actually. So it's interesting that the first thing I would share. Have a look at your careers page. What does your organization look like from the outside looking in? And when I started exploring this as a topic area, I started looking at lots of different careers pages of lots of different organizations, and I won't name any names, but it was pretty, how should I say, alarming how many careers pages were all just white guys, especially when talking about the engineering teams. So try to present an organization that might be appealing or inclusive to a broad group of folks. And that might mean if you've got some women on the team, put them up on your careers page, of course, if they're happy to do that. So it's, just getting somebody interested in the organization is the hardest part, I think. Give them a reason to want to come and talk to you. What is it about your organization that might make them feel like they belong or are welcome or supported. And then the next thing is in the job ad itself. I hate rock stars and gurus and all these things that you quite often see in job ads. We don't see too much of that anymore, thankfully, but they're definitely still around. The language we use is really, really important. There's actually a tool called Textio, Textio, I think it's textio.com, that does, it actually does what they call a gender sentiment analysis. And often if you've got a very highly masculine job ad, that can become a bit off-putting to women or even just a broader group of folks. I think try to aim for a gender neutral or maybe a slightly more feminine approach if you want to attract more women in particular. And then one other really important thing is just to be aware that when you've got this really long laundry list of requirements, so you've got to know Ruby, you've got to know JavaScript, you've got to know Node, you've got to know Postgres, you've got to know Mongo, whatever, all the things, if a guy looks at that list and says, you know, there's 10 items, I know 2 or 3, yep, cool, I'm good. Women tend not to take that approach. Once again, it's a bit of a blanket statement, but women tend to look at a list like that and say, unless I know all the things on that list, I'm not going to apply. And there has been some studies on that, but I actually experienced this, you know, very personally with my wife a couple of years ago. She came up to me she came and chat to me one evening after work, and she said, "Oh man, I saw this job today, and it looks amazing. I'd love to be able to apply for that." And she showed me the job out on my phone or whatever, and I had a look at it. I said, "Babe, you can totally apply for that. What do you mean you can't apply?" And she goes, "Oh, but I don't know that one. I can't remember what it was, but there was one thing on the requirements list that she didn't have an experience in." And I said, "You know, this is my, you know, egotistical maleness, I guess." And I said, "I could totally do that." You know, I was trying to encourage her to do it, and she applied and she got the job. And we just had a bit of a chuckle afterwards, saying, "You know what, just go for it." So, but at the same time, I think it's incumbent on the people writing these job ads to maybe keep the requirements a bit more broad and try to get interest in candidates first, and then explore different capabilities, interests, and pursuits, and so forth throughout the interview process, rather than making it like a hardline list of requirements on the job ad. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I get asked it a lot, and yeah, I'm never sure how to answer it. So
yeah, that's fair enough. It's a really tricky problem. I'll give you that.
Yeah, because you don't want to put no requirements on there, and yep.
yeah. I mean, one way I've tried it before. I don't know how effective this particular example is. I don't have any evidence to say yes or no, but one thing to think about is, instead of saying must have Postgres, must have Mongo, maybe just can be something like has experience in databases, you know, and don't be too specific. Maybe this person knows MySQL really, really well. And I mean, if you've ever used MySQL and Postgres, it's, you know, they're not that different really. There's some quirks and you know, little nuances between the two, but essentially they're the same thing. So if somebody knows MySQL and you've got Postgres on your job ad, you know, who might be self-selecting out of that? Don't know. Maybe just say databases and see what you get.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, cool.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for that. That was a really good talk. I totally agree with basically all of that. Any thoughts on quotas when you're hiring people? I've gone to recruitment agencies and said, I want you to give me, however many men you give me, give me the same number of women, stuff like that. Which is easy to do if you're outsourcing it, and it puts all the pressure on them.
Yeah.
But internally, I've kind of like informally done that at times, where I'll kind of enforce it in my pipeline where I'm reviewing CVs and stuff like that, without really telling anyone I'm doing it. I just kind of quietly do it so I don't get in a fight with people about it.
Yeah.
But is that a reasonable thing to do?
It is to an extent, but there's I wouldn't try not to take it to sort of the nth degree, if that makes sense. So there's I guess a couple of things. I mean, the very heart of the issue, there is, you know, only 24% of software engineers are women. So to get to 50-50, every company to get to 50-50, I mean, it's just not possible at the moment, the way that the industry is made up. So some organizations will get closer than others, and as a whole, as an industry, we should totally pursue it, but it's going to require, you know, changes to the education system. It's going to require kind of broader cultural discussion about, you know, how we perceive technology as an industry and how we see software engineers and so forth. So this, you know, that's a much longer discussion. When we're talking about just, you know, our one sort of piece of the world in terms of how many people can we hire, then I think 50-50 at the moment, sadly, is unrealistic. So I tend to think of it more about targets rather than quotas. So we want to try to increase the diversity in our organization. So that just means we need to make sure that we're giving as many women, say, or minorities, or, you know, however you want to think about it, an opportunity to come and work for us as possible. You know, that means yes, maybe we have quotas for the number of people that apply. Maybe we have quotas for the number of people that are hired. But in terms of, sorry, are interviewed rather, but in terms of how many people are hired, it's perhaps more think of it as a target. So we want to try and get as many women in the team as we can. One thing you do need to be a little bit careful of is, you know, if you as an organization are perceived to be exclusively hiring women and at the expense of men, I'm not saying that's what anyone would do, but that would technically be against the law, the, you know, the equal opportunity stuff. So I think it's more about making sure that you're giving women as good an opportunity to be considered for a role as possible. And that means, you know, being very aware of your interviewing process, how you're attracting women to your organization. You can totally give recruiters a target or even a quota, you know, at that end of the pipeline, that's totally fine. When it comes to the, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. Of course, I'm always willing to be challenged on this stuff. But my personal opinion is that once you get to the actual making of the hire, it's probably better to think of it more of a target than a quota.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I've never hit it, by the way. No one's ever hit the 50-50 thing. No. But yeah, but generally the way I'll do it, it's kind of like the slide you did with the boxes. You know, if I'm like on the fence about someone and I've already got enough men in the pipeline, I'll probably go sort of no. Whereas if it's a woman, I'll go the other way.
Yeah.
If you know, sometimes you don't know from a CV or whatever. Like at the moment we're hiring. Sorry, I missed a bit at the start of the. I heard it, but I was taking the dog out for a pee when for the hiring thing. We are actually hiring at the moment. Work for a company called 5 Good Friends. It's in the jobs Slack channel. But we're hiring 2 roles. And I said to my boss, like if we hire one male and 1 female for that, fine. If we hire 2 females, fine. But if we hire 2 men, probably wouldn't be that happy about that. So let's try and not do that. Let's try and not make the problem worse in this particular hiring round.
Yeah, I agree. It's I definitely think we need to have a tendency in that direction. You know, we've got to start to move the needle a bit in our organizations and in our industry as a whole. It's sadly not perhaps quite as straightforward as just saying this is our quota, we've got to meet it. It's more nuanced than that. You know, Aubrey Blanche, former Atlassian, now Culture Amp, actually talks about this idea of belonging. So everyone that comes to join you in your organization should feel welcomed and feel like they belong. And that's not necessarily solved just by getting 50% women. That in itself is not necessarily going to solve sort of the fundamental challenges that we have. It's about making your organization a great place to work and giving everybody the same opportunities, you know, in the technology industry. So, which is a you know, philosophy I very much subscribe to. Hope that answers your question.
It does, yeah. That's good.
Oh, no worries. Anyone else?
I'm curious, do you have thoughts on how to better sort of recognize or acknowledge the value of glue work that is being done?
I don't have a hard and fast answer for you, but I'm sort of thinking on the fly a bit. I mean, one thing is perhaps just to, you know, calling it out in whatever channels your organization uses. You know, if it's maybe there's a Slack channel, say, hey, thanks to so-and-so for doing X. Or it's stand-up saying thanks for doing it. I think, you know, whatever ways your organization recognizes good work, I think just making glue work a part of that is a good first step, I guess. On the other hand, if your organization is not very good at that to begin with, then maybe you've got bigger problems, but I would try to make it part of the sort of you know, team communications that you've already got in place if you can. Have a look at the talk too. I'll share around the slides. Tanya has got a few good tips in her talk actually that I can't actually recall off the top of my head, but I remember there being some good stuff. So have a look.
I have a quick one. You mentioned that 51% of women leave engineering at some time in their career.
Yep.
And from your research that you have done, like, can you tell us what do you think would be the main reasons? Like, aside from the pay gap, maybe, like, would there be anything else?
Yeah, so the research that I've done centers around a study by the Harvard Business Review, or Harvard Business School, that was published in the Harvard Business Review. And it's certainly not limited to pay gap. A lot of it has to do with advancement or lack thereof. You know, a lot of women that were surveyed in the study that they did sort of shared stories of not feeling like they're advanced as quickly as their male peers. And actually, it's not just a feeling. Very many of them simply were not advanced as quickly as their male peers. And you know, that's often related to salary and remuneration as well. But it was more than that for the women in this study. It was also about recognition, so recognition of good work done, and you know, promotion and more responsibility as well. So that was sort of the major factors that were considered in that report. But there have been other reports that also talk about casual workplace sexism. That's another big one. And sexism is not as, you know, it's not maybe the really overt sort of stereotypical sexism that you might think of. It's not, you know, people using the C word or the B word, or, you know, some guy slapping a girl on the bum or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure that stuff still happens somewhere, but it's not, that stuff doesn't tend to happen much anymore. It's actually much more subtle and subversive than that. And in some ways it's worse, you know, because it's not as clear, it's not as obvious. And a lot of studies have been done on the challenges that women face in the workplace around those kinds of subtle problems of sexism. So there's sort of the three main things, I guess, that I've read about. So gender pay gap, lack of advancement, and workplace sexism. So it's kind of tricky. I feel like I'm just staring at my black screen. I can't see any of you.
You can, there's a little gallery mode thing. If you show grid video, you can kind of, you might be able to expand it out and see us over your slides.
See, I'm on Linux. Maybe it's not supported on Linux.
Oh, I don't know. Sorry, I've never zoomed on.
All good. I'll just imagine your faces.
Yeah, well.
Actually, I might stop sharing if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I can see.
Hey Dan, one question for Dan. What percentage of men leave the industry?
It's something like, there actually been some varying reports on that, and it's a bit hard to get clear data. And actually there's varying reports on the number of women as well. Depending on who you ask, it's anywhere between 45 and 60, but the numbers for men are somewhere between 12 and 17, I think. So men do leave, and I'm sure there's lots of reasons. Technology is a hard industry to work in. You know, it's pretty, if you don't keep up with your learning, then you can sometimes fall behind, and you know, I think it takes a certain personality, so maybe not everyone's cut out for it. But then a lot of people, when they say somebody leaves, it's not necessarily leaving the industry, but maybe they're just no longer a software engineer, so maybe they become a product manager or a designer or something like that. And I think sometimes those sort of subtle differences can get caught up in the data. It's probably why we get such different numbers. But you know, regardless of how you look at it, there are significantly more women that leave than men.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.